My ex left me for my slender best friend because I was too fat. On their wedding day, her mom called me and said, "You do not want to miss this." The phone rang at 9:52 a.m. on the morning of my ex-girlfriend's wedding to the man she'd left me for, and I almost let it ring out. I was standing in my kitchen barefoot, still in the faded gray two-lane sweatshirt I'd slept in, waiting on a delivery order of 2 breakfast sandwiches and a large coffee, and fully committed to doing nothing at all for the next 12 hours. Phone face down, blinds half shut, plan locked in. Get through this one day the way I'd gotten through the last 6 months, by putting my head down and moving and refusing to look sideways at anything that might slow me. The name on the screen was a contact I hadn't opened since the afternoon I carried my things out of Sloane's apartment in 2 trips. Unknown number, but the area code was one I knew by heart. When I answered, I recognized the voice before she finished the first word. Crisp. Certain. The voice of a woman who wore pearls to a Sunday farmer's market. "Grant," said Catherine Ashford, "I need you to come to Ashley Point right now. Don't change. Don't stop to think about it. Just get in your car." She paused just long enough to make sure I was still on the line. "You do not want to miss this." I should have hung up. I should have set the phone back on the counter, gone back to my coffee, and let whatever was unfolding on the other end of that call unfold without me anywhere near it. Instead, I stood there on the cold kitchen tile in my bare feet and felt something move under me. The low structural shift you feel in a building a half second before you understand it is the building and not you. I grabbed my keys. You need to understand who Sloane Ashford was before I tell you who she became. When I met her, I was 27 and pulling 60-hour weeks as a junior compliance analyst at Harwell Reed Partners, a mid-sized financial group where I was very good at a job no child dreams of doing. Sloane was a corporate attorney at a firm where people still wore full suits on the Friday before a long weekend. We met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner on King Street. I'd ordered a bottle of wine that went with nothing on the table, and she corrected me without a trace of cruelty in it, just a clean, matter-of-fact confidence. And when I laughed instead of getting defensive, she looked at me like I'd surprised her. I remember thinking, very clearly, this one is safe. She was poised in a way that never tipped into cold, funny in the dry, economical way of people who have never once had to work a room. Her mother was old Charleston money. Her father had been a federal judge before he passed. She drove a spotless dark green Land Rover, owned exactly 2 sets of very expensive sheets, and held opinions about French New Wave cinema that I found insufferable in a way I somehow looked forward to. We were together 3 years. I loved her in that quiet, accumulating way where you build a life around a person without ever deciding to, where their routines quietly overwrite yours, where their opinions seep into your opinions, and where somewhere in the second year you notice you have stopped taking up your whole share of a room because folding yourself a little smaller keeps the peace, because the relationship has a gravity to it that always tilts toward her. I stopped ordering the wine. I stopped finishing my own sentences at her firm's dinners. I learned the exact volume at which my opinions were charming to her, and the exact half-step past it where her mouth went flat, and I lived a careful inch under that line for 2 years without once calling it what it was. I did not notice it happening. That is the part that still embarrasses me most. Callum Hayes had been my best friend since we were both 19 and assigned to the same freshman hall. 12 years all told. He was the best man at my brother's wedding. He was the person I called the night my father's second scan came back worse than the first. He was the one who sat on the floor of my apartment with me until sunrise once. A bad winter I was coming apart for reasons I couldn't put a name to, and just stayed. He was lean and easy in his body in a way I never was. The kind of good-looking that made strangers assume they already knew him, and he worked in brand strategy at a creative agency and had a laugh that made a whole table lean in to find out what was funny. He and Sloane got along. I was glad they got along. I was glad the woman I loved liked my oldest friend. I was, in hindsight, the most trusting fool in the state of South Carolina. The first time I felt it, that thin metallic drop in the stomach that is your nervous system flagging a thing your brain is not ready to hold, was about 8 months before it all came down. Sloane and I had been texting all week about a birthday dinner for a friend of ours named Priya. Group chat logistics, the usual small tedium. She'd been a little clipped with me, a little elsewhere. I chalked it up to a bad stretch at the firm. I told myself I was inventing a problem. I was inventing a lot back then, apparently, because I was buried. Work had me flying to Dallas and back twice inside 3 weeks. Sloane had a filing that was eating her alive, and whatever was going on with Callum registered as background static under the louder noise of my own calendar. Then, the night of Priya's dinner, Callum canceled at the last minute, a migraine. Sloane, who'd planned to come by late after a client call, never showed at all. Later I texted her, "Where'd you end up?" She said she'd gone home early, had a deposition prep at 7 the next morning, needed the sleep. I told her Callum had bailed too. She said something like, "That's too bad." And I remember thinking it was a strange, flat little answer, and then I remember immediately not thinking about it. I told myself it was nothing. This was the first loop. The fourth loop was a smell. I know how that sounds. Bear with me. I came back to Sloane's apartment on a Thursday evening, the place I effectively lived 3 and 4 nights a week by then, and the front room smelled faintly of something I knew and couldn't place for a second and a half. Then I placed it. Callum's cologne. A specific thing, cedar and something dark marker under it in a squat matte bottle he'd carried back from a work trip to Lisbon and worn ever since. I stood in her living room and breathed through my nose and thought he was here. And then I thought they must have grabbed lunch or he swung by to drop something off. They run in the same circles now, it's normal. I thought about asking her. I decided not to. I didn't want to be that guy. Suspicious, snooping, conjuring problems out of the air of a room. That's what I told myself. The truth is, I think I didn't ask because some part of me already understood that asking would force one of two outcomes. She'd lie or she wouldn't. And I wasn't ready for either. Her body language in bed that night was the quiet version of wrong. Not cold exactly, just concluded. Like a door that is technically still open and hasn't moved on its hinges in years. I stared at the ceiling a long time. I told myself it was nothing. This was the fourth loop. The fifth was the most deliberate. About 6 weeks before I came home and found them, Sloan and I had a fight. Nothing loud, just a slow circling argument about the future, about timelines, about when exactly we were going to stop living in this half-committed in-between and actually decide. I'd raised it before. She always answered with the same reasonable, faintly distant patience. I'm not going anywhere, Grant. I just don't want to rush a thing this size. This time landed different. This time she said, I think we have some fundamental incompatibilities we should probably take an honest look at. I remember exactly how the word incompatibilities sat in the air. Corporate, clinical, the language of a memo, not a life. I asked her what she meant. She said, I just think there are things about where we are that I've been honest with myself about, that we haven't been honest about together. I asked her to be specific. She wouldn't. She said she needed to think. She said, maybe we both should. I drove home that night and sat at my own kitchen table until midnight, building careful arguments for why this was only a rough patch, why 3 years earned the discomfort of one hard conversation, why the correct move was patience and steadiness and not panic. I texted Callum the next morning. Sloan and I had a weird fight, man. I'm honestly a little scared. He wrote back inside 4 minutes. Oh no. Tell me everything. We talked for an hour. He said all the right things. He said she was probably just underwater at work. He said sometimes people need a beat to catch up to what they already want. He said give it a few days, see how it settles. He knew exactly what she was planning. He walked me through it anyway, gently, like a friend. I didn't find out for 6 more weeks. I told myself it was nothing. This was the fifth loop. The second loop I only understood later. I'd taken a work from home Wednesday and decided, on a whim, to drop a coffee off at Callum's agency on my lunch. An easy, unannounced thing you do for a friend of 12 years whose office is 8 minutes from yours. The girl at his front desk told me he was out at an off-site with a client and wouldn't be back before 3. I left the coffee on his desk with a sticky note in my terrible handwriting. He texted 4 hours later, "You're the best. So sorry I missed you. Normal. Except that when I mentioned it to Sloan that evening, she paused half a second too long before she said, oh, that's a shame. Not, what were you doing on that side of town? Not, when did you and Callum last actually hang out? Just, oh, that's a shame. Half a second. I filed it and kept moving. I was becoming, without noticing, a man who filed things. A man who caught a wrong note in a room and slid it into a drawer instead of asking about it, because asking might cost me something I'd already decided in advance I couldn't afford to lose. I told myself it was nothing. This was the second loop. The third loop was quieter than all of them. It was a feeling. There's a kind of intimacy in a long relationship where you know a person's silences as well as their sentences, where you can read the exact texture of how they're absent without knowing what the absence is made of. Sloan had started going quiet in a new way. Not tired quiet, not work quiet. A different grade of it. Closed. The quiet of someone who has already decided something and is waiting for the right morning to say it. I felt it for weeks before I could name it, and instead of naming it, I turned it on myself. I decided I was being needy, clingy, that old reliable fear of taking up too much space, wanting too much, being too much of a person to comfortably keep. I told myself it was nothing. Then I came home on a Tuesday in April. I'd had a client call run 20 minutes long, and I'd taken the interstate instead of the surface streets, and I got to Sloan's building at 7:14 instead of closer to 8, the way I'd guessed when I texted her that afternoon. My key still worked. I let myself in, set my bag down by the door, and heard the television going in the bedroom. The light down the hall was warm and gold, and there was music under the sound of the TV, something with a low beat, and I thought, good, she's finally letting herself relax. I pushed the bedroom door open, the gray duvet, my old green hoodie, the one I'd left there in the fall, bunched behind someone's head as a pillow. The two of them tangled together like they'd been there for hours, laughing at something on the screen. Callum saw me first. He didn't scramble. He didn't flinch. He just went very still. And then slowly, Sloan turned her head. I remember the exact quality of the silence, the way the TV just kept playing, the way my brain tried to rearrange what my eyes were sending it, ran the math, failed, ran it again. I felt the air in my chest go solid. I said, very clearly, okay. I turned around. I picked up my bag. I walked out. She called 17 times before midnight. I answered on the 18th. Her explanation was organized. That was the part that took the legs out from under me. How organized it was, like she'd rehearsed it in front of a mirror. It had been going on 3 months. She should have told me sooner. She'd been trying to find the right time. She cared about me deeply, deeply. I have not heard that word the same way since. Deeply is the word word you reach for when you want the whole weight of love and none of the cost of having actually done it. She said she'd realized, calmly, the way you'd flag a formatting error in a contract, that she and I ran on different frequencies, that I hadn't been taking very good care of myself lately, that we didn't match. That word, match. She said it like it was neutral, structural, like she was describing two systems that failed to integrate, and not two people who had shared a bed and a life and a future for 3 years. I don't remember what I said after that. I remember ending the call. I remember sitting in my car in the parking garage under my own building for a very long time. I remember driving home at some point and standing in my kitchen and not being able to locate a single reason to move any part of my body. Callum texted me that night. I'm so sorry you had to find out this way. Not, I'm sorry I did this. Just, I'm sorry you had to find out. Neither of them ever apologized. They got engaged instead. I got a contractor bag for the things she boxed up and a front row seat to their feed. Couple photos within weeks. A ring within 3 months. People kept forwarding me screenshots. Some cruel, some pretending not to be. I muted half my contacts. And then one night I sat down on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and let the whole thing cave inward. Every shape I'd bent myself into to fit. Every opinion I'd sanded down. Every time I'd swallowed a feeling because I was scared of being too much for a room. I sat there a long while. Then I got up. I was at the gym the next morning at 5:47. Not for her. Not to become some before and after she'd regret. I need to be precise about this because the whole story reads wrong if you get the motive wrong. I went because I'd spent 3 years slowly vanishing inside something that required me to be less, and I was finished being less. I went because some animal part of me needed to remember what I was actually made of. I went because grief, I was learning, had a physical texture, heavy and shapeless and living in the body as much as the mind, and I wanted to go meet it somewhere I was allowed to push back against it. The first morning I made it 8 minutes on the treadmill before my lungs lit up and the edges of my vision went soft. I walked to the locker room, into the third stall from the left, and I stayed in there until it passed. Then I washed my face, dried it, and walked back out. The second morning I went back anyway. That's the whole story of the next 6 months, really. Alarms that went off in the dark. A trainer named Colton Vega, 15 years in the field. A former college athlete who'd shredded a knee at 23 and spent a decade rebuilding himself into something that worked again. Who looked at my intake sheet on day one and said, without any ceremony, we're going to build you back up from the foundation, the real one. He didn't ask about my ex. He didn't ask why I was in his gym at 5:47 3 mornings a week with hollow eyes and the shut face of a man in the middle of something. He just wrote a program and ran it. The first 6 weeks were humbling. There's no softer word for it. My body fought me in ways I hadn't braced for. Not just the soreness, but a deep bone-level fatigue that sleep didn't fully touch. I'd come home, eat whatever Colton had told me to, and be out by 9. I canceled things. I went dark online. People who hadn't checked on me in months suddenly surfaced in my messages, which I came to understand as the specific cruelty of the age we live in. Nobody shows up when your life quietly falls apart, but everybody notices the moment you stop performing it. I kept going anyway. By the second month, I could run 2 miles without stopping. By the third, Colton sent me to a colleague, Dr. Nadia Rao, a dietitian who worked out of a practice off Coleman Boulevard and rebuilt the way I ate around fuel instead of punishment. No counting towards some cruel little number. Just learning, actually learning, what a body needs to do the things you're asking it to do. That distinction changed more than I can explain. I stopped weighing food like evidence against myself and started weighing it like the input it was. Some mornings, the hour in that gym was the only part of the day that felt like mine, the only stretch of it nobody else had a single opinion about, and I guarded it the way a man guards the last dry match in his pocket. By the 4th month, I was sleeping 8 hours and waking before the alarm. By the 5th, a woman from my old office passed me in the gym lot and looked at me for a full 3 seconds before her face changed and she recognized me. I started seeing a therapist in there too, a Dr. Claire Osei, a dozen years in practice, a focus on attachment and the patterns we drag from one relationship into the next. She had a gift for questions that sounded simple until you tried to actually answer one. The one I kept circling back to was, when did you start deciding your needs were negotiable? I sat with that for 3 sessions before I could answer it, and when I could, the answer turned out to predate Sloan by a long way. She'd just been the most recent tenant in a space I'd been renting out under market for most of my life. Understanding that didn't fix everything. It changed the angle of the light on it. Meal prep on Sundays. Protein I actually tracked. The discovery that a torn down muscle and a grief feel nearly identical from the inside, and that the body doesn't much care which one it's carrying, it just adapts as long as you keep showing up. Grief, it turns out, can be picked up, set down, and picked up again. I didn't become a different person in 6 months. I became a more complete version of the one I'd been the whole time. The last time I stepped on a scale, not obsessively, just to see, I'd lost 27 pounds. What no scale could weigh was everything else that had shifted. My posture, the way I came through a doorway, the sound of my own voice answering a question without softening it into an apology first. I'd stopped making myself smaller. I was done with that for good. Now let me tell you about the wedding. Sloan and Callum had booked Ashley Point Country Club, the kind of place where where everything is the color of cream and money never raises its voice. The ceremony was set for 2. There were 140 guests. Catherine Ashford had, by one mutual acquaintance's estimate, spent somewhere north of $50,000 on the day. My plan for it was ironclad. Delivery on the way, bad TV, phone on silent, get through it the way I'd gotten through all of it, by moving forward and not picking at a thing that had finally scarred over. At 9:52, the unknown number called. At 9:58, I was in my car. I pulled into the Ashley Point lot at 10:26. The parking lot looked like the staging area for a disaster film. Guests in formal wear stood in tight little knots on the manicured lawn, whispering behind their programs. A woman in a champagne-colored dress was crying into her phone by the fountain. 2 men in matching ties paced the top of the front steps like they were waiting on news from a surgeon. Inside was worse. A chair had been knocked over near the entrance to the main hall and nobody had set it upright. One of the centerpieces, a massive white and ivory arrangement that had to have run $400, had been swept off its stand, petals and water soaking dark into the cream carpet. A champagne flute lay shattered by the window seat, and no one had swept that either. The event coordinator, a woman named Renata Vaughn who had a sterling name in the Charleston wedding world and had run the Ainsley Brooks reception in 2022, was standing by the bar with her tablet clutched to her chest, wearing the expression of a person actively reconsidering her entire career. Catherine Ashford found me near the door. She was 62 years old, the daughter of a state senator and the widow of a federal judge, and she had spent a lifetime never once letting a room catch her rattled. She was rattled now. The pearls were in place. The lipstick was in place. Everything under it had begun to fracture at the edges. She took both my hands. Callum has been seeing someone else, she said, for months. There are screenshots. She barely stopped for breath. A bridesmaid's boyfriend found them this morning on Callum's own phone. Of all the reckless things, he's been messaging a woman named Ren Adler. Runs a gallery downtown, apparently. Awful texts, going back at least 6 months. He called Sloane boring in them. He wrote that he'd enjoy the ring and the wedding and see how long he could ride it out before he needed an exit. Her voice dropped to something between a whisper and a hiss. He called my daughter a placeholder. I kept my face very still. Sloane found out during the first look photos, Catherine said. She confronted him out in the garden. He told her she'd never actually made him feel like more than a good decision on paper. Said he never wanted to be tied down in the first place, and he walked out, still in the suit. She let out a short, disbelieving breath. A $5,800 suit. There was a silence. So here we are, she said, and her eyes moved over me then, slowly, deliberately, head to foot, the exact way they had 3 years ago the first afternoon Sloane brought me home to that big cool house on the water. The same appraisal, except this time the arithmetic came out somewhere different. Grant, she said, look at you. I waited. You always loved her, she said. You were loyal. You were steady. And now look at you. You match her. That word, match. I felt something settle low in my stomach, and it wasn't anger and it wasn't triumph. It was quieter and heavier than either. 3 years ago, that same word out of that same mouth would have felt like being welcomed into a family. Standing in that wrecked cream hallway with the petals going brown into the carpet, it felt like being handed a receipt for something I'd already paid for in full and returned. We could do something small today, she said. Already moving. Already arranging. Something simple. A civil ceremony. Everyone is already here. The flowers are already paid for. The officiant is still in the building. He's a flexible man. He's done civil ceremonies in 45 minutes. We could save the day, Grant. We could save all of it. Mrs. Ashford, I said. You called me here, I said very carefully, to marry your daughter at her canceled wedding to my former best friend, 6 hours from now. Don't let a little wounded pride, she started. She sat me down 6 months ago, I said, and told me I didn't take care of myself, that I didn't match her. Those were her words, not mine. Her jaw tightened. She humiliated herself 6 months ago, I said. Today is just everybody else finally catching up to it. The silence between us was total. I looked at the toppled centerpiece bleeding into the carpet, at the shattered flute nobody had swept, at the chair nobody had bothered to set right, at 140 people in formal wear drifting across a lawn with nowhere left to be. I hope she's okay, I said, and I meant it, but I won't be the bandage. I turned and I walked out. I'd love to tell you I drove home with the windows down and the music up, feeling like a man in the final act of a film. I'd love to tell you it was cinematic. The truth is, I drove home shaking so hard I had to pull over twice. The first time in a gas station lot on Folly Road, where I sat with both hands locked on the wheel and my breath going in these fast, shallow cycles and thought, what just happened? The second time at a red light on Savannah Highway, where I started laughing, the kind of laugh that lives one frequency over from crying, and couldn't stop for the better part of 2 minutes. By the time I got home, the shaking had burned off. I changed out of the jeans I'd thrown on in my rush out the door. I made coffee I actually wanted. I sat down on my own couch with both feet up under me and let the quiet back into the room. I had not, I realized, spent 1 second thinking about what Sloane was feeling. I thought about it now. The image of her, that controlled, quietly certain woman, confronting Callum among the hedges while 140 people waited on the other side of a wall. The look on her face when he turned and left her there. The vows she'd have been running silently behind her teeth all morning. The enormous private effort of getting yourself ready for the biggest moment of a life you thought you were building. I thought about all of that. And then I thought about the gray duvet and my green hoodie behind Callum's head and the way neither of them had so much as flinched. I drank my coffee. At 3:40, a text came in from a number I didn't have saved. It turned out to be a groomsman, a guy named Ronnie Platt I'd met exactly twice at their engagement dinner the spring before. He'd gotten my number off Priya. "It's all canceled," he wrote. "Sloane's at her mom's. Word is you showed up and turned Mrs. Ashford down flat. Couple people are saying you came to gloat. Figured you'd want to know." I set the phone face down. At 5:15, Priya called and I let it go to voicemail. 3 minutes of her narrating the whole thing at high speed, ending with the detail that Callum had already posted a photo from a rooftop bar across town, an old-fashioned on a railing, caption "Life is short." At 6:20, my sister called from Atlanta, who had somehow heard the entire saga already and wanted every piece of it immediately. I talked to her for 40 minutes. She laughed in all the right places. Then she said, "Grant, are you okay?" And I said yes. And she said, "Okay actually," or "Okay performance." And I said, after a second, "Actually okay." She believed me because it was true. At 7:42, there were 3 heavy knocks on my front door. I already knew. I'd known it was coming since the gas station lot, the way you know a storm is coming when the sky has held one particular color all afternoon. There was no version of this day that ended without Sloane Ashford eventually standing on my step. That was just the arithmetic of who she was. When something broke in her hands, she went straight to the one person who had always, reliably, been standing there to help her hold it. I took a long breath. I set my mug on the coffee table. I ran a hand back through my hair, which had grown out over the 6 months into something thicker than I'd worn in years. I walked to the door. I opened it. She looked like a woman who had been through something. That's the only honest way to put it. The soft twist she'd had her hair pinned into had come half down. Her makeup had been carefully repaired at least once, and had started to go again around the eyes. She'd changed out of the dress into slacks and a blouse, and the blouse was buttoned one hole off. Her eyes were red and hollowed out in a way I hadn't seen since her father's funeral. She had clearly rehearsed something. Her mouth opened around the first word of it, and then she actually saw me. Not the way she'd been seeing me for 3 years. That quick, certain, already catalogued glance of a person who is sure she knows exactly what she's looking at. She saw me. The way you finally see a thing when you're forced to throw out everything you assumed about it and start the count over. Her eyes dropped to my feet and climbed, slow, and stopped somewhere around my face and stayed there. I watched the rehearsed words come apart somewhere behind her teeth before a single one of them made it out. Her jaw moved and nothing came with it. Her eyes were doing that very specific thing, that recalibration where you're trying to lay a new picture down over an old one, and the two of them keep refusing to line up. The silence went on long enough to become its own sentence. She blinked. "Grant," she said, finally. Just the name, nothing behind it. "Sloane," I said. The neighborhood kept moving around us. A car, a street over, a television through somebody's open window, the far-off ticking of a lawn sprinkler. The porch light caught the angles of her face, and she looked like a person who had aimed her whole life at one fixed point and arrived to find nothing standing there. "I heard what you told my mother," she said at last. "She shouldn't have called you." She said it like she was reading it off the inside of her own eyelids. "I didn't ask her to do that." "I wouldn't have?" "I know," I said. Another silence. "You look," she started and stopped. Her throat worked. "You look really different." "I know," I said. "How are you?" I asked, and I meant it plainly. No edge on it. She opened her mouth, closed it. "I'm good, Sloane." I said it without any particular weight, just the fact of it. Set down between us on the step. "I'm genuinely good." And she stood there. And watching her, I understood that there were 100 things she wanted to say, and that this woman had never once in the years I'd known her been caught without the words for a thing, and that for the first time since the night we met, she had absolutely nothing that would work. No argument that fit the shape of the moment, no clean clinical frame she could set around it, no version of match or incompatible or frequency that would function standing in front of the person she'd used those words on, who had taken every one of them and quietly, without an audience, without a scene, set them down and refused them. She hadn't lost Callum today. She'd realized what she threw away 6 months ago. That was a different thing. That was worse. "Good night, Sloane," I said, and I closed the door.